On the bench today, we have a Tascam 424 Mark II. This particular one came in its original box, which is usually a good sign, but let's see. Well, it turns on, so that's a good start. Looks like the cassette bay cover is a bit banged up though. Comes with a free tape too. Sweet. The first step is to check all the inputs and knobs. I like to run through all the inputs and knob functions first, so I can tell how much cleaning the pots need, and to make sure the mixer side is actually working before testing the tape functions. The fewer things you have to troubleshoot at once, the easier job it is to find the real problem. Now that we're sure the mixer is working correctly, let's test recording. When I do this, I like to use a song that I know well. That way I can easily tell if something is distorted or missing on playback, or if there's some more subtle issue that might be going on. With something recorded on all 4 channels, let's rewind and see how it came out. Well, looks like all the channels record and play back. Excellent. It's a great place to start from. Now, let's see about cleaning out those dirty pots and fixing that bay cover. When you flip it over, you'll notice that the 424 Mark II has a lot of screws, and a number of holes that don't actually have screws in them. Luckily, every hole that has a screw in it has a small plastic nub just underneath it. If you feel around, or even just look, it makes it much easier than trying to just jam your screwdriver down every hole and see if there's a screw there. Let's zoom through that screw removal now. Lifting the top slightly will dislodge the pitch control knob as well as any screws that got stuck in place. And it will also make it clear that I forgot the 3 screws from the back. Oops, better take those out too. Now that we have it open, let's see if we can shake out the loose bits that I can hear rattling around inside, and then take out the tape transport to check on the belts. There's only one screw holding the transport mechanism in place, but to get the mechanism out, you have to also remove the circuit board with the transport controls on it, so you can reach the power connection for the transport motor. With that unplugged, you can just lift out the transport mechanism. The rear cage of the transport is held on with 4 very small screws, 2 of which also hold the plastic tape guides in place. Carefully remove these and set them aside somewhere you won't lose them. They're very small screws. Once the screws are removed, the halves can be carefully pulled apart, exposing the 2 belts. Unfortunately, at this point my camera battery died, and I didn't notice until I had already finished changing the belts and putting the transport back together. The process isn't all that photogenic anyway, and you can probably figure it out without too much help. When the belts are changed, simply reverse the removal process by plugging the motor back in, reseating the transport, carefully putting the control PCB back in place, and screwing everything in. At this point, we'll move on to cleaning the heads. Use the highest percentage of alcohol available to you and a Q-tip. Make sure to give both the read-write heads and the erase heads a good scrubbing. There may well be years of oxide dust left behind on them, and it's remarkable how much a little dust will affect your playback and recording. Don't forget to scrub off the capstan and the pinch wheel also. With the bottom part done, we move on to the mixer PCB. To get at this, we have to remove the aluminum-backed plastic sheet that serves as a bit of a Faraday cage for the mixer PCB. A few screws hold this in place, and one of them has a grounding lead on it. Don't forget to replace this when you reassemble, or you will get an awful hum in your recordings. Ask me how I found that out. With the shield out of the way, we now have even more screws to remove. I like to leave a few in place to hold the board steady so that I can then remove the knobs and sliders. You could take the knobs and sliders off before even removing the shielding, but to each their own. With the knobs and sliders removed, it's time to remove the remaining screws and then carefully unbend the metal flaps connecting the front shield to the PCB. Very gently press up on the audio I/O boards to give the mixer PCB enough clearance to hinge forward out of the case. Then disconnect the additional grounding connection that you've exposed. Now there are even more slider caps to remove. And finally, we're ready to finish disassembling the mixer section. Unscrew the remaining screws holding the audio I/O boards in place, then lift the entire assembly free of the case. Now that the entire board is exposed, we can get to work with our contact cleaner. This is the kind I prefer. Spray each slider and potentiometer with the cleaner, then work it through its full range of motion a few times. Do the same with all of the switches too. Oxides can build up anywhere. When everything has been cleaned, spray out each component with compressed air. I'll take it out to my garage workshop to use the compressor, but you can use canned air just the same. After that, apply a little bit more of the contact cleaner to each contact, move it through its paces a little bit, and set it aside to dry. In the meantime, let's see about fixing that tape bay cover. The cover is held in place by two pins mounted to screwed in place brackets. As you can see, one of the arms of the cover has broken off. This is unfortunately common. I happen to have a new old stock replacement on hand, along with the spring, taken from a different Tascam that turned out to be unrepairable. I'll use that to replace this broken one. But if you're not so lucky, but are lucky enough to have the broken piece still rattling around inside your case, you can solvent weld the pieces together with great success. The cover is made of polycarbonate, so you won't get a good bond with superglue. You need to use the proper solvent instead. I've done this numerous times with great results. Note the proper assembly of the spring onto the mounting pin. With both mounting pins screwed back into place, and the spring pulled into position, the bay cover works like new again. Next, it's time to clean the years of grime off the front of the unit. I like to use a dry Q-tip for this, especially on the first pass, so I can rub most of the dirt off just that way. For any especially filthy areas, a little rubbing alcohol on the Q-tip can be used to help move the dirt along. After a quick wipe down with a rag, I also like to cut my Q-tips at a 45-degree angle to clean out the grooves on the front of the Tascam. A surprising amount of dirt and grime accumulates here. As you can see, the knobs have yellowed a bit over time from exposure to UV light. But luckily, this is fixable. We could use retrobright and more UV light, or, taking a slightly less DIY approach, we can use Hair Developer and a UV nail curing station. We'll let that sit for a few hours to do its thing. In the meantime, let's put the mixer section back together. First, we put the metal shielding back in place and bend its tabs over to make sure it's firmly attached. Then, we add the selection slider caps back on. Don't forget this step, or you'll have to go through the work of taking it all apart again when it's reassembled and you discover that you've forgotten them. Trust me, I've done this. With those in place, we can return the mixer board to its case. I recommend sliding the bottom of the mixer PCB into place first, and getting the ports lined up on there, then hinging it into place and pushing the I/O section in afterwards. Now we start the process of putting back the many screws. There are lots of screws and lots of holes. Not all of the holes get screws at this point, but if you look closely on the PCB, you'll see that every hole that needs a screw right now has a handy little screw silkscreened next to it, so you don't have to take photos as you're disassembling or guess. With the board back in place, replace the aluminum shielding, get the cables routed correctly through the holes they were in before, and screw it all into place. Don't forget that grounding plug. I've done it a couple times, and trust me, you need it there. With the preliminary work done, we can put the halves together and start really calibrating it. The plugs can be a little finicky and hard to work with, especially the power and grounding plugs at the far back. There's not a lot of space to work with, they're very small plugs, it's just not an easy thing to do. You just have to go slowly, be careful, and don't push too hard. You don't want to bend those pins. If you do, it's not the end of the world. You can bend them back and it's going to be okay, but it's more work, it's more of a pain. Just be careful. Takes a little patience, but you'll get there. Now is as good a time as any to put the knobs back too. There are so many knobs. So many knobs. Oh, finally. With the knobs in place, we can insert a cassette and start our calibration. The first step is to feed each channel a known 0 decibel signal, in this case coming from my signal generator. We record that to each track to get an idea of the current recording level. It is technically better practice to begin with a tape that has a known to be calibrated 0 decibel signal on it, so you can test the playback first, ensure that's set correctly, then test the recording and playback again. If you do it the way that I'm doing here, you possibly run the risk of pushing the record hotter than it needs to be and raising your noise floor a little bit. But if you don't have access to a test tape like that, you can do exactly what we're doing here and you still get a perfectly usable, if not technically perfect, result. With the tape recorded, we rewind, play back, see if we get 0 decibels as we should. Pretty close to it, ever so slightly on low at 1 and 4, turn the pots up on those channels slightly, and then we're good to go. So now it's time to close our Tascam back up and give it a test. Remember, the screws go in the holes that have a small plastic nub beneath them. As a final demonstration, we will record a test song on our tape, splitting it across all 4 tracks. For this one, I've chosen Nocturnally by Amulets from the YouTube audio library. On playback, don't mind the funny stereo effects. That's not because of the recording itself or any issue with the Tascam. It's because I chose a very cheap, very crappy cable to use to record from, and, well, buy good cables. With it all recorded, please enjoy Nocturnally by Amulets.